Hello everybody and welcome to my final video of 2021, which will hopefully be posted on the final day of 2021. And today I would like to take an opportunity to figure out my favorite book this year. Now, previously I've done a tier ranking of all the books that I've done this year, but I have weird thoughts on a lot of these books and I thought it might be more fun to just do a tournament bracket, to have this tournament bracket determine my favorite book of 2021. I randomly seeded all the books, so there may be a lot of unfair matchups, and also I may have to remind myself of some of these books because I don't remember every single one of these books, especially the books in the Dresden Files, individually as much as I remember the series as a whole. But because you guys like to watch me struggle to compare books, I thought I would do the tournament style. And also, since I can never pick a favorite book for 2021, here you are going to end up with a tiered, ordered list in theory of all the books that were my favorites. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the books were seeded randomly. Some books got a bye for the first round, so this is going to be interesting. We may see some early rounds where books that I didn't love make it further than they should. We also may see some rounds where really good books have to compete against each other. I haven't actually looked that much at the seeding because I just hit random and we're going to just do it live. But here I am going to talk about my favorite books of 2021. I'm going to try to keep spoilers at a very, very minimal. So hopefully everybody should be able to watch this video, but we are going to determine the best books of 2021 that I read starting now. For round one, the books that we have competing are Howl's Moving Castle versus The Maidens. The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. The Maidens is the follow-up to one of the most popular books of 2019, which was called The Silent Patient. The Silent Patient was a book that I loved. Many people also loved it. What did I think about The Maidens? I thought that it was an enjoyable read that had a terrible ending that was both poorly executed and also extremely poorly foreshadowed. I don't know. I really think that as time has gone on, my thoughts of The Maidens have only gone down. Howl's Moving Castle, unfortunately though, is a book that I had a lot of hopes for going in. It's a lot of people's favorite books. They read it as a kid. I liked all of the characters from Howl's Moving Castle. I thought that it was a very funny cast of characters. I think it would make for a very funny sitcom style television show. Unfortunately, I barely understood or cared about what was going on in the story. It was like when the characters were talking to each other, I thought that was fun and I enjoyed that part, but I never really followed the plot. There were so many weird plot twists, some of which I thought were bold and cool, some of which I didn't care about. This book is one that I read and I sort of had to force myself to get through it because I lost interest somewhere around the midway point, and I did finish it. It's not one of my favorite books. I'm curious to see how far it gets, but for this round one first matchup, it's going to be Howl's Moving Castle because I did enjoy Howl's Moving Castle more than The Maidens. The next matchup is Death Masks versus Morning Star. Now, Death Masks was one of the first books in the Dresden Files where I really started to think that I might like that series. If you watch my Dresden Files video that I posted earlier this year called Should You Read the Dresden Files, I express that I wasn't super in love with the series. I thought it was fine and fun, but eventually I grew to love the series. It became one of my favorite series of all time. Death Masks is one of the first books, I believe it's book 5 or 6, maybe 5 in the Dresden Files. Death Masks was the first book where I really started enjoying it. They brought in a really interesting villain, some really interesting long-term lore implications, and that's where I started thinking, maybe there's more to this Dresden series than I initially might have assumed. Morning Star, however, was the amazing conclusion to the Red Rising trilogy, a series that I had essentially written off as not being for me until Alan from the Library of Alexandria read that series as a read-along, and I jumped along because a lot of my friends were reading it. Honestly, one of the main reasons that I picked up this book is because Christy Lewis from the channel Christy Lewis, Dostoevsky in Space, a good friend of mine, picked up this book and loved it. It was a reread for her, and I was like, everything that everyone is saying about this book is not what I remember thinking that series was. I picked up Red Rising because it was available from my library right then and there, and I ended up loving this trilogy. We're going to talk about the other 2 books in the trilogy later on, but Morning Star was an amazing finale for that series, with also an ending that I cannot talk about because I said I didn't want to spoil things, but the author, he does some very bold moves that I both respect and also despise. If you want to hear my detailed thoughts on that, go to the Library of Alexandria's channel, and there is a full in-depth discussion that we did for Morningstar. I was part of that discussion. It was a live stream, and it was very fun, and you can hear my thoughts on the insanity that was the ending of Morningstar there. But if I have to pick here, Morningstar I did enjoy more than Death Masks, though Dresden might get some love later on in this tournament. The next matchup we have here is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, my very first Neil Gaiman read, versus Changes from the Dresden Files. And this really just is not a fair fight, because The Ocean at the End of the Lane was a book that when I very first picked it up, I didn't really know what to expect, but I sort of expected it to almost be this Pacific Northwest almost feeling story, and it's not what I got. Instead, what I got was a book that felt like a dark, twisted book with Chronicles of Narnia vibes, which is, it is a dark fairy tale that instead of being what your normal fairy tales are about, it's this dark version. And I enjoyed the discussions for The Ocean at the End of the Lane maybe more than I enjoyed reading the book itself. Having the discussions in the group buddy read, it was a patron buddy read for one of the months this year. And discussing that book with other people that loved it allowed me to appreciate it a lot more. The way that it looks at themes of horror through the perspective of a child in a fairy tale sense is really, really cool. And I actually really value my reading experience of that book. It wasn't my favorite book that I read this year by any means. It's probably going to lose this round, but that book deserves more credit than I thought it did. I was going to make a dedicated review for that one, but it didn't line up with my schedule at the time. Nevertheless, I do want to give some love to The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Unfortunately, Changes from the Dresden Files was a book that I was not emotionally prepared for. You see, when a lot of people are talking about the Dresden Files, or if you're watching reviews for the Dresden Files, you hear a lot of people talk about Changes as being a huge turning point for the series, and this is not incorrect at all. Changes was something, however, that when I was reading through the Dresden Files myself, I got in binge mode because I started loving it. And I didn't watch any videos about it. I didn't know anything about the books going in. And so I don't want to give too much about what's going on. But the things that happen in Changes, well, spoilers, a lot of things change. Like, it changes the perspective of the entire series moving forward. The formulas and directions that you thought the story was going, it changes everything. And like that, it feels like a dumb meme or cliche to say, but Changes really was an insane twist for that series, and it's where I couldn't stop. I had to binge read the rest of the series after getting to that book. So yeah, unfortunately for The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I do think deserves love, Changes is going to be winning this round. Up next, we have Jade War versus House of M. Jade War is the second book in the Greenbone Saga series, and it was a book that took me, I'm not kidding, maybe 6 months to read from the time that I was initially supposed to read this book. The first book in the Greenbone Saga was called Jade City, and I thought that it was fun. It was different than I expected it to be. For those people that know video games, one of my favorite underrated video games is a video game entitled Sleeping Dog, and I was getting vibes that Jade City might be extremely Sleeping Dogs-like. However, the author went a different direction. Now, if you've watched a lot of reviews for the Greenbone Saga, it is one of the most hyped series on BookTube this year. Because of that, I even included it on my listicle video on like major fantasy series to check out if you're just getting back into fantasy reading. Because I do feel like it is a majorly hyped book series that a lot of people love and critics praise very highly as being the future of fantasy in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, I struggled to like this book in any major way. I might have ended up with a 3-star on that one, but it was only through great suffering that I finished that book. There were parts of that story that I absolutely hated, parts that I would be invested in, but largely I felt like that book had some major set pieces that it wanted to hit, and the pieces in between that felt like the author was just sort of, I can't make judgments on what the author was thinking, but what it feels like is the author was just writing to get to the next point, but even she didn't necessarily know how she wanted to get there. So she just sort of free wrote, discovery writing, pantsing. These are all words for when an author just writes off the top of their head instead of following an outline. It seemed like the outline had some major points in the book she wanted to hit, and then the rest was just kind of filled in. And during those points, I was extremely bored. I would have DNF'd this book if I wasn't buddy reading it. It was still such a bad situation because I buddy read it so poorly that I was behind. Everyone else finished it before me. It was a struggle. House of M was a book that I read when I was watching WandaVision, the television show, because a lot of the things from that series were taken from the ideas in House of M in the similar ways that all of the movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe don't directly follow the storyline of any individual comic series, but they often take inspirations and story beats from lots of these series. House of M is one of them that focused on Wanda Scarlet Witch as a character. It was okay, but I had more positive vibes on it than I had of Jade War. So this is not a book if I would have tier ranked these books, or would have moved very far, but it's going to beat Jade War because I was mad at Jade War by the time that I finished Jade War so much that I thought I read a different book than everyone else did. Next up is Rabbids versus Light of the Jedi. Rabbids is a book that takes place in the same universe as one of my favorite audio drama series. I will take this opportunity once again to say, if you are the type of person that enjoys audiobooks, maybe you should check out audio dramas. They're like audiobooks, but they're acted and they're sounds. I love audio dramas, but every time I talk about audio dramas on this channel, it tends to not do well algorithmically. I don't know if that's because it doesn't line up or because people don't give audio dramas a chance. Audio dramas are amazing. I love them so much. I will not stop talking about them. Rabbids is one of my favorite audio dramas of all time. It's a small, short piece that I think is very cohesive. There's a lot of mystery, but there's a lot of conclusion. I think it is one of the only audio dramas that I listen to that actually wraps up in a way that I enjoyed the ending immensely. Rabbids, the book, takes place in this same universe. It is more of a sequel to the original Rabbids. Unfortunately, Rabbids is the type of story that doesn't necessarily need a sequel, so the book, if you've listened to the audio drama, tries to pull off some of the same maneuvers as spoiler points even when you already understand them. It's one of those things where once you know the plot twists are less interesting than they could have been. It was still a very fun read, a read that I read pretty quickly, but it did not live up to the expectations of the original Rabbids audio drama. But fortunately for Rabbids, it is competing against Light of the Jedi, the first book in the High Republic era of the Star Wars franchise, and much like many of the Star Wars properties lately, it was fine. I didn't love it. There was a lot of fairly obvious places I think it could have done better. It feels a little bit like a cash-in, which is of course kind of what it is, because it is a novel taking place in a series that's just trying to cash in on people's nostalgia. There are a lot of people that like Light of the Jedi. I don't want to say it's a horrible book. I just want to say that it was only okay. I didn't love it. I felt like there were a lot of amateurish elements to it, and as something that was supposed to set up a universe as something that I would super want to care about and want to invest myself in, it didn't do a great job at that because I don't necessarily care about checking out the rest of the era that it takes place in. It didn't do a very good job at that, so Rabbids is going to win this round. Now we get to Dresden book Skin Game versus Midnight Water City. Skin Game. I'm going to have to do a quick Google search to remind myself what takes place in Skin Game. Okay, after refreshing myself on the specifics of what happened in Skin Game, that is one of the awesome Dresden Files books. It's not necessarily my favorite, but there are some incredible moments inside of Skin Game. Without spoilers, I can't necessarily say them, but if you've read Skin Game, you know what I'm talking about. But we are going to be comparing it to Midnight Water City, which is a book that when I finished it, I both wondered how it was supposed to be the first book in a trilogy because it felt incredibly final, but also the way that Midnight Water City plays out, I wasn't sure if I was reading the book wrong or if because the protagonist is an octogenarian, if he was understanding the book wrong, but I felt like it was an interesting concept executed in a way that wasn't super engaging, and instead it felt a little bit monotonous. You would view the same historical events from multiple perspectives, with each perspective sort of changing the context and the motives of characters in those historical events. And unfortunately, I felt it was a book that was easy to read and I was interested in it, but some of the twists that it took and the way that it exposits its own story wasn't the best. and doesn't leave me super interested in a sequel for that one. And of course, it's against one of the better Dresden books, so Dresden's going to take this round. This is another brutal matchup because we have Red Rising versus How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days. Red Rising was an incredible book that as soon as I picked it up, I was immediately engaged, and I loved that book from start to finish way more than I expected to, and I ended up loving that trilogy quite a bit as well. Unfortunately, it's up against How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days, which was a romance book about a girl who has a crush on Keanu Reeves for like all of her adult life, maybe some of her kid life, for a long time. And she finds out Keanu Reeves is going to be getting married. And so she goes off on a quest to figure out how to stop Keanu Reeves' wedding, maybe marry him herself, while also maybe, secretly, accidentally falling in love with her best friend. It's one of those stories that is very tried and true, but the book is a lot deeper and deals with themes a lot deeper than you might expect in a story with that premise. It really sucks because there's quite a few books on this list that I enjoyed significantly less than How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days. But if I'm being honest with myself, if I compare it to Red Rising with me resonated more on multiple different levels. It sucks that this matchup happened so early because I could have seen How to Marry Keanu Reeves making it much further in this tournament. We're going to have to put Red Rising as the winner of this round. Next up is Small Favor versus Peace Talks. These are both Dresden books. Peace Talks was the first Dresden book of 2 Dresden books that were released at the same time. Or more accurately, I can say that they were written at the same time and released as 2 separate books because they were so large, and Dresden books normally aren't that large. The publisher decided to make some money on that, and I'm sure that Butcher wasn't complaining about that either, so he wrote it in 2 parts. Peace Talks is the first of those 2 parts. As a standalone entry, it's not the most interesting book in the Dresden Files. If you include it with Battleground, which is the book that it goes along with, as a whole, I think it is quite good. There are some seriously impactful moments that happen in that story. The thing is, if you're just talking about Peace Talks alone, it's very difficult to talk about, especially when compared to Small Favor, which has some of my favorite side characters, some really good moments and character growth in that specific episode as well. So if I had to pick here, it's going to be Small Favor. I don't know if that's going to make anybody mad or not, but Small Favor over Peace Talks. The next round is going to be Red Seas Under Red Skies, the sequel to The Lies of Loch Lamora, a 5-star read. That is an amazing book that might be one of my favorite books. It's hard to compare, but Red Seas Under Red Skies did not live up to the potential of that series, in my opinion. I felt like, I don't remember if I said this in my review or not, but I felt like Red Seas Under Red Skies felt like really good fan fiction written by someone who loved The Lies of Loch Lamora, and they wrote the characters they loved into new scenarios where there was some amazing character moments, and the plot is not great. I don't know. It just, overall, it was much more meandery. It was a lot less focused. There were huge chunks of the book where the book makes you think you're doing one thing and then it completely alters it and goes the other way, which is something The Lies of Loch Lamora pulls off a lot better. It's not one of my favorite books, but it's going against Summer Night, which was maybe my least favorite book in the Dresden Files. Unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know. Summer Night is one of the books that introduces one of the huge major ongoing storylines that continues through the rest of the series, a storyline that I ended up loving a lot. There are parts of Small Favor that I thought were funny in a charming way, but ultimately I didn't care about the plot of Summer Night through most of it. I don't remember a ton of it except the stuff that was relevant and carried on through the rest. I didn't enjoy Summer Night all that much, so even the Red Seas Under Red Skies was not one of my favorite books, and it was disappointing compared to the original. I'm gonna give this round to Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. Next up, we have The Extinction Files versus Avengers Disassembled. Avengers Disassembled was another one of the stories that I read along with WandaVision. It was one of the other stories that there were elements of that story, inspiration of that story was used to make the WandaVision storyline. I don't remember very much about this one. The Extinction Files, however, is one of my favorite self-published authors, A.G. Riddle, doing what he does best. It's not my favorite of his books, but it's very good, very fun, extremely quick read because he does compelling, fast-paced science fiction thrillers extremely well. Maybe one of the best that I've read. Not that it's a genre that I've read all that much in, but I really, really like him. I feel like if you don't like Blake Crouch's style of science fiction thriller. This one usually has a main character that's not quite as annoying. The side characters are usually more interestingly handled in A.G. Riddle books versus Blake Crouch books. This is not to put Blake Crouch down. I love Blake Crouch books, but I know that there are some legitimate complaints that other people have with his books. I feel like A.G. Riddle is a different style of the same genre that a lot of people may love. If you have not read an A.G. Riddle book, I suggest you look up the synopsis of one and see if it's for you. He is legitimately one of my favorite authors. I have loved all of the books that I've read of his. The first trilogy that he wrote, I only read the first book, and that one was a little bit weaker. It's clear that his writing has improved significantly since that point. But The Extinction Files is his newest book. It came out this year, and I loved it. So yeah, The Extinction Files is going to win this round. Golden Sun versus An Unkindness of Magicians. This is another completely unfair round because An Unkindness of Magicians is a book that I never would have heard of, except that Murphy Napier in some of her videos that are a little bit older talked about loving this book. And so I feel like a lot of people, when they're just watching Big Booktubers, are going to find some love for this book because Murphy has a great channel and she makes reading sound really, really interesting. And she talks about the books that she loves in a way that always makes them sound compelling. An Unkindness of Magicians is one that I felt like I had to check out. When it won, I believe, also a patron buddy read vote for the Patreon campaign on my Discord server. Unfortunately, I did not like An Unkindness of Magicians very much at all. I thought it didn't handle almost anything super well. I do have a full review for that book. I don't want to spend time dunking on it here because here we're trying to decide the best books. And there is no way An Unkindness of Magicians is going to beat Golden Sun, which is the book in the Red Rising series that most people think is actually good. I feel like I like the first book, Red Rising, a lot more than most people do. Golden Sun is usually where people jump on board and start loving the series. I enjoyed the first one. I didn't enjoy Golden Sun as much as other people seemed to, but Golden Sun is definitely going to beat out An Unkindness of Magicians for this round. Next up is Battleground versus Play Dead. Battleground being the most recent book we have in the Dresden Files, and yeah, there is some insane crazy things that happen in this epic, massive battle, which I don't feel like is a spoiler with a title like Battleground right after a book called Peace Talks. Battleground is the second half of that book that I mentioned earlier that was written all at once, and Battleground is a book that is controversial in some ways with the fans, where there were some things that I don't think were handled as well as previous elements of the series. Like, there are some bad guys introduced around the time of Battleground that are not as well integrated into the world at the point that they become a big deal in Battleground as has been done previously by Butcher in the series. Because of that, there are elements of the story that I feel fall a little bit flat, but there's also elements of the story that I feel like were handled extremely well, and there were lots of super emotionally charged moments that left me feeling very raw, but like very happy also in a weird way. I am extremely happy to see where the Dresden Files series goes. Battleground is an amazing, amazing book. Play Dead was Ted Decker's newest book, which I was a little bit of two minds about. Ted Decker being the Christian published author, he's oftentimes labeled as being like the Christian Stephen King. I had some serious beef with the message, the theming of Play Dead, though, the way that it was portrayed in the books. And I talk about that in detail in my Play Dead review, which you could check out if you care about the specifics of the things that I think it messes up about the Christianity message of the book. So while I found it an enjoying read, I didn't think that it was all that important or amazing in the long run, because it's one of those books where, like, sometimes you read a book and you think it's fun, but then it ends up having a moral that you can't get behind. That was Play Dead. It wasn't without enjoyment. I had fun with it, but also definitely Battleground is going to win this round. The Name of the Wind versus Senlin Ascends. The Name of the Wind being the first book in the Kingkiller Chronicles. I have a non-spoiler rant about my experience with the Kingkiller Chronicles that you can check out on the channel right now. And I still am not fully set on what I think about the Kingkiller Chronicles, because there are so many things about it that I think are incredible and amazing. And there are so many criticisms that I have with it. Some of them I feel like I can come up with justifications for why they are the way they are. and some of them I can't. But it is such a captivating book. Once I got into it, that I couldn't put it down, and it has stuck with me in a super long-term way. I'm curious how far the Kingkiller series is going to end up in this list, because it's a series that I have such conflicting thoughts about, because I love the highs so much, and the lows, sometimes I didn't like them at all, and sometimes I was baffled. Once again, if you want to see the full extent of my madness with that series, I do talk about it spoiler-free in another video that's here available on the channel. Senlin Ascends is a book that I first heard about from my friend Ramsey, and also Alan, Library of Alexandria, brought a lot of love to that one this year. I ended up reading the first book in that series, and I thought that it was very fun, like a weird version of Alice in Wonderland is what it felt like. It's very strange with all the things that go down in that series. I don't know if it's a series that I would say I love the way that some people latch onto it. It's definitely one that I enjoyed. It's definitely one that I will continue, but I don't have the desperate urge to continue that some people seem to have. The parts of Senlin that didn't super work for me, I thought were fine. I read through them. I thought they were a little boring. The parts of The Name of the Wind that didn't work for me, I was frustrated by and confused by, but the highs were still higher in The Name of the Wind. That's probably going to offend some people. I'm sure that seeing this book get knocked off in round one will definitely not appeal to people, but The Name of the Wind is a hugely popular book that a lot of people love for a good reason. And while I feel like I could rant super hard against The Name of the Wind in a way that I couldn't do with Senlin Ascends, there's also parts of The Name of the Wind that I absolutely love. Next up for this round, we have The Only Good Indians versus The Alloy of Law. The Only Good Indians being by Stephen Graham Jones, and Alloy of Law being Brandon Sanderson's first entry into Mistborn Era 2. And this is another sucky first round battle, because I feel like The Only Good Indians is a really fascinating, really awesome book that I personally am hurt. I'm hurt that it's going to get knocked down in the first round here. It's a horror book that also is literary fantasy fiction horror that explores a lot of Native American struggles and perspectives, while also being a gruesome horror story that's written in a way that seems to turn a lot of people off, but it's a very stream of consciousness sort of writing style that I absolutely loved, and I listened to it in an audiobook, and I feel like it worked really, really well. You'll see a lot of criticisms about the prose in that story, but I loved it, and I would like to read more from Stephen Graham Jones. Unfortunately, it's going against Alloy of Law, which is one of my favorite reads this year. Spoiler, I guess, for future parts to come. But The Alloy of Law was a book that made me realize the haters for Mistborn Era 2 are probably smoking crack cocaine. And I say that as a joke. A lot of people just thought it was going to be like Mistborn Era 1, and it is such a drastic tone shift from Mistborn Era 1 that I think it turned a lot of people off. It was very different type of main character, very different tone, very different level of action, and the way that it handles everything. It's like a Western action story. I wrote like a one-sentence Goodreads review for this one. I'm going to look up what I said. I was just so flabbergasted at how much I loved this book, so surprised at how much I loved this book, that it's one of my favorite reads of the year if I just had to state one off the top of my head. My review for it on Goodreads says, Sad Boy and Cussmouth, the cowboy lawman, is the fantasy version of the television show Burn Notice. If any of those things sound interesting to you, you may also love The Alloy of Law, one of the most fun books that I read in 2021. The final matchup for round one is The Wise Man's Fear versus The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. The Wise Man's Fear being the second book of the Kingkiller Chronicles, which I feel like in general has so many less redeeming qualities than the first book. But because it's a continuation of the characters and the world and the lore that I loved, I still enjoyed it probably more than the average person who read Wise Man's Fear, though I understand every single criticism I've heard against it, and I feel that as well. The Wise Man's Fear, I feel like, is an easier book for me to say. How do I say this? The Wise Man's Fear is a book that I didn't love and I have a lot more beef with than even the original one. And a lot of my criticisms from the original one are exemplified in this one exponentially. There's less highs, but the highs that are there are still really cool. I think all of the criticism that I've heard of the book is valid, but it didn't bother me as much as some other people. But the book that it's against is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I believe I made a video about that I don't think was a rant review, but I do have some fairly harsh criticisms of that book, with it feeling maybe needlessly long, a little bit up its own butt a little bit. And while I thought that it was beautiful in a lot of ways, I also felt it was a little bit ridiculous in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that entirely negatively, because a lot of these books I could describe as ridiculous in their own way, including the book I just praised a lot, Alloy of Law. But this one didn't necessarily work for me as much, and it also is a lot longer than it needed to be to do what it did. And also, the Wise Man's Fear is going to push through this round. That's what I'm going to say. And thus, we conclude round one. I'm going to eat a mouthful of Skittles, and then we can start round two. Here is my Skittles. Let's do it. I love Skittles so much. Round two. Fight. Now, this is once again going to be a little bit of a controversy here on this channel, because some of the books that got a buy because of the number of books that I had is going to anger some, including myself, because there are books that made it to round two that I would have definitely put below books that didn't make it through round one because they were matched against amazing books. But this is the way the cookie crumbles. This is how we determine my favorite and best book of 2021. So we're going to go ahead and start up with the first matchup of round two. First up, it is Ship of Magic versus Howl's Moving Castle. See, Ship of Magic is a book that I posted an extremely disappointed review of. Ship of Magic is probably the most disappointing book that I read this year. Because of the highs that I felt during the Farseer trilogy, I thought that trilogy was amazing. I expected a lot of the same things that I loved about the Farseer trilogy and Ship of Magic, and I just didn't connect with the story or the characters of Ship of Magic the way that I wish that I had. And after talking about that series with other people that didn't love Farseer as much as me, I found out that a lot of the criticisms that those people have of Farseer are the same criticisms that I had of Ship of Magic. And I guess it's just one of those, one of them might click with you and the other one might not. For some people, of course, they'll both click. And of course, for some people, neither will click. But there are certain elements that don't work in Ship of Magic that they miss from Farseer and vice versa. For me, I was one of the people that didn't love Ship of Magic as much as I wanted it to because of my extreme love for the Farseer trilogy. Because of it, I have not continued. I plan on continuing because I really would like to get back to like my favorite characters from the Farseer trilogy. I love what Robin Hobb did as a writer, and I trust her to be able to do more things that I will love. But because I didn't love Ship of Magic, it's just one that I haven't continued yet. But unfortunately, it is against Howl's Moving Castle, and I talked about not loving Howl's Moving Castle all that much. So even though it's way longer, see, both of these books I feel like are longer than they need to be, but Ship of Magic is much longer than Howl's Moving Castle. But I do believe that I enjoyed Ship of Magic more. I'm more excited to read book 2 than I am for ever going back to Howl's Moving Castle. No diss on the people that love Howl's Moving Castle. I think I see what you love there. I do think some people are going to be happy to see Ship of Magic make it farther than they initially thought that it might, considering it was one of my most disappointing books this year. Ship of Magic is going to push forward. Here we have Daniel Green's Breach of Peace versus Piranesi. And Piranesi is a book that is like Narnia also, where if the ocean at the end of the lane is like the dark, scary version, Piranesi is a happy version of a Chronicles of Narnia like fairy tale that isn't just as, it's not just as childrenish, but it's just as fairy tale-ish. It's just as whimsical. It sparks the imagination in ways that my favorite children's stories do. Piranesi is a character. Is Piranesi the name? I feel like the name of the character is never said. The main character in Piranesi, we're going to call it Piranesi, is a character that I love, and he has a huge fan base and multiple discords that I'm part of. Piranesi is an amazing, great book. Breach of Peace is Daniel Green's first book in his, I think, trilogy. It's his first book in the series that he's trying to write. I recently got some more comments of people that read Breach of Peace and didn't love it. I do not feel differently about Breach of Peace really than I did when I read Breach of Peace, which is I thought it was compelling. I thought that parts were really interestingly handled, and I loved the horror elements a lot. I love the way that it ended a lot, and I'm very interested in continuing along with the series, which is funny because I haven't read book 2, and I have book 2. I was supposed to review book 2. I was even given an arc of book 2 to review, but I didn't because that part of my life was a disaster. But I loved Breach of Peace, and I thought that it was really interesting, regardless of the criticisms that other people have for it. That's fair. That's fine. I loved it. Piranesi, I also loved for completely different reasons. But Piranesi did some stuff so well, and the prose in Piranesi is really well done. This is a hard one, but I think that if I just had to pick one of these to be my better read for this year, I'm gonna have to go with Piranesi. This is another tough one. We got Strange the Dreamer versus Morning Star. Strange the Dreamer is a YA, I guess, literary fantasy book about a guy named Laszlo Strange, and it's a very sweet book about another very sweet character. I believe if we're talking about like some of the sweetest characters that I read this year, it's going to be like Piranesi and Laszlo Strange. And I thought this book was really good. It was one of the books that I've seen criticized for being too slow that I actually feel like was extremely slow. But I tend to not hate that for the most part in a lot of books. Even though I criticized Jade War for that, I feel like the parts of Strange the Dreamer that were slow were things that I wanted to be slow. I like Strange the Dreamer quite a bit, and I think there were a lot of people rooting for me to not like that one. So I was pleasantly surprised when I did. Now, the elephant in the room for Strange the Dreamer is it ends on an extremely insane cliffhanger. Like, insane cliffhanger. And I didn't finish. I haven't read Muse of Nightmares, which let's just talk about how Muse of Nightmares might be one of the best sequel titles I can think of in my entire life. But Muse of Nightmares is a book that I have not picked up yet. It's not because I didn't enjoy the Strange the Dreamer book. It's because I'm bad as a person at finishing almost anything. And there are people like Michaela, a friend in the Discord and patron supporter, who have serious beef with the ability that I have to start books and not finish them, regardless of the urgency that the book ends off. I read Six of Crows and haven't read Crooked Kingdom either, which is another sort of point of contention there that I have with Michaela. Strange the Dreamer was a really good book, and for some reason I just haven't picked up the next one. Morning Star, once again, is the conclusion of the Red Rising series, and I loved it, and it made me feel things, and I thought it was really cool, and I love the way that it ended, even though the author was very dirty, very bold, audacious even. I had more fun. It's going to sound bad because it's going to sound like I only pick books that have fun versus books that have other emotional impact. If the Farseer trilogy were in this thing, it would win a lot of things that hurt my soul. There are books that hurt my soul that I love, but Strange the Dreamer did not make as much of an impact on me as Morning Star. I wish Strange the Dreamer had been against something else that I didn't like as much. Morning Star's going forward. The next round is another insane round that probably shouldn't have happened the way that it did. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier versus Changes. Rebecca is an early thriller. It's a classic that's also like a gothic novel. It has creepy elements. It's mysterious. There's a lot of themes depending on how you interpret it. And also there's Changes, one of the best books in the Dresden Files. It's not even a fair matchup. Lots of people love Daphne du Maurier. Lots of people love Rebecca, but Changes though. It's going to be Changes. For me, Rebecca wouldn't have even made it past round 1 if I had the choice. I'm sorry. Next up, we have Winds of Strife versus House of M. As a reminder, House of M was that X-Men comic that led to WandaVision. Winds of Strife is the self-published book by Uri Gutman, and it was a really interesting premise that didn't click for me as well as I had hoped it had. But if it sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend it. Many more people that are my friends that I value their opinions read it and loved it a lot more than I did. So I'm not going to say don't check it out. I'm going to say it wasn't for me. It was a magic system based on emotion, similar to a Sanderson style thing, but it was emotion based instead of metal based or sadness based, like the Stormlight Archive or whatever, which I guess is emotion based. You know what I'm talking about. On this list, I think I'm going to pick House of M. Next, we have Cold Days and the Dresden Files versus Rabbits. Rabbits, as I described before, is an awesome book that I think is fast-paced and really fun, and it's a continuation of my favorite audio drama. It's not my favorite continuation. It's against Cold Days, one of the books in the second half of the Dresden Files series. I think it's really awesome, and there's a lot of really cool things that happen in that story as far as progression in the abilities and nature and state of the world and the characters and the powers and world building and everything. So it's going to go to Cold Days. Rabbits is an awesome book that you should check out the synopsis for if you think it sounds interesting. I also have a review for it. Blood Rights is one of the books that I think I was still in the process of figuring out if I loved Dresden or not. It was really compelling, but crap. There's a lot of things introduced in Blood Rights that are like some of my favorite characters and setups for the series, but I feel like if I have to pick between Blood Rights and Skin Game, I'm probably going to pick Skin Game. Dresden fans will know. Next, we have Ghost Story, another book from the Dresden Files versus Red Rising. Now, Ghost Story, I feel like, is a book that a lot of people may have beef with in the Dresden Files because of things that I can't talk about because they're spoilers, but basically characters are in a state where by the end of the book, you know where everything is going to end up, but the book is just a long way to get there. I think that's a way I can talk about it without spoiling too much. But Red Rising is a book. See, it's hard because I read Ghost Story as a binge the same way that I read something like Red Rising. And there are major things that happen in Ghost Story. I should have just put the Dresden Files as a whole thing, but I knew that people were going to ask for it as an individual book. This is so hard. I love elements of Ghost Story for things that I can't talk about as spoilers here. I love what it does to change the pace of the story and to introduce new things in the story and move characters along in ways that you would not expect. But I also love Red Rising because it just works so hard for me. And there were some things about it that I loved. How do I pick? I want to just go by emotions, but my emotions here are just betraying me. Ghost Story or Red Rising? Ghost Story or Red Rising? There's so much representation of Dresden on this list. I think it's annoying that there's 17 books to Dresden. I didn't read them all this year, but there's so many books in Dresden that's going to dominate this list in a lot of ways. But if I loved them, I don't want that to be a problem. And there are things that I loved about Red Rising. Frick! Because I knew nothing about Red Rising, the setup for that book was really impactful for me. There's things that I don't think were handled the best, but also there's parts of it that are really cool. Red Rising handles both like sad boy themes and also Ghost Story handles sad boy themes. Frick, this is going to be I think this might be one of the harder matchups that we see here in this tournament. I don't know. I'm going to pick Red Rising. I think I'm going to pick Red Rising. I may regret this later on. People hate me in the comments. Leave a comment down below if you think this is a problem. Leave a like if you think it's a good idea or if you think it's a bad idea. Don't leave a dislike because nobody will see it. Just leave a like. I'll know the difference between whether it was a good like or a hate like. Next, we have Shadows of Self, one of the other books from Mistborn Era 2 that goes with Small Favor. Shadows of Self was a book that I thought was super interesting for tackling some complex themes in a lighthearted book more head-on than I thought that it would, and I love it for that. Also, it's Mistborn Era 2, which I love. Small Favor, which I looked up before, is a Dresden book that has a lot of elements that I also loved. Frick. I'm not going to overthink this. Frick. This one's a hard one. These are both books that I ripped through super quickly. They're both books I was super invested in. They're both books that feature side characters that I love. They're both books that tackle themes that I think are really interesting. They're both books in series that are some of my favorite series of all time. How do I compare Small Favor and Shadows of Self? I'm not going to overthink it. I'm going to pick Shadows of Self, I think. Deadbeat versus Red Seas Under Red Skies. Deadbeat is another one of the Dresden Files that I was still not completely sure that I love the series, but I was becoming fully convinced that I was going to love this series. Like I said, I can't spoil things. There's some really cool elements introduced that are multiple book spanning plot points that start in Deadbeat, and it's the beginning of a super important set of storylines. It's against Red Seas Under Red Skies. If I were to pick the best moments from each of these books, Red Seas Under Red Skies would beat this category. If I were to pick the most important book in series for things that are going to be set up in the future, it's probably going to be Deadbeat. Deadbeat does really good world building, but Red Seas Under Red Skies does really good world building. And the character moments from Red Seas Under Red Skies that are good are better than the best in this book for Dresden. But it feels weird seeing Red Seas Under Red Skies make it this far in the tournament. Crap. It feels weird to say this, but when I'm looking at this in hindsight, even though I was frustrated with some of the stuff from Red Seas, this wasn't one of the Dresden books that had the most huge story moments. And Red Seas Under Red Skies, even though I think that it was significantly less good than the first book, I think it's actually going to take round 2 here, which feels weird to say, because it was one of my more disappointing books this year. But I think this one's going to go to Red Seas Under Red Skies. What do you think about that? What do you think about that one? Let me know if I did it wrong. Proven Guilty versus The Extinction Files. I've said a lot of the things that I want to say praising A.G. Riddle for The Extinction Files. It is not his best book. I believe that the Solar War trilogy and also the Extinction Trials. Is this book called The Extinction Trials? No, his previous duology was called The Extinction Trials. Extinction Files. Frick, I think I did it wrong, and the whole time this book has actually been The Extinction Trials, and the other book is called The Extinction Files. I mislabeled that. I did a big goof. Proven Guilty has some seriously powerful moments in the Dresden Files series, and I keep talking about Dresden, so I'm just going to give this one to Proven Guilty and say that you should still go check out A.G. Riddle. Project Hail Mary versus Golden Sun. Project Hail Mary is written by Andy Weir, who is also the author that wrote The Martian, which got turned into a movie called The Martian with Matt Damon, where he was a spaceman that wasn't a jerk. Spoilers for another movie that Matt Damon was a spaceman in. I haven't read The Martian, but because I did like that movie, I decided I would read Project Hail Mary, even though his book in between those two didn't get as much love. Project Hail Mary was quite a bit of fun. It was super lighthearted. It was the opposite of Grimdark in so many ways, while also still having semi-significant stakes. It has a fun side character. Golden Sun is the middle book in a trilogy that I loved. Golden Sun is a book that most people love so much because they didn't love the first book in the Red Rising as much as me. I thought Golden Sun in general had some awesome moments, but I didn't love as much as other people did. If I had to pick between these two, I think I'm going to pick Project Hail Mary. In tone, it's almost completely opposite to Golden Sun because it's so positive in so many ways, but there's also a lot of science, and Golden Sun taught me nothing except sad lessons. So I'm going to pick Project Hail Mary here. What the heck? I'd like to take this moment to dedicate to the people that love Ferdinand. He's still here. He's in the video still. Ferdinand was created by me in a recent tag video, and he is something that shouldn't be here. He's a stack of books that I created to be my new book friend. I have a lot of book friends that are much better than Ferdinand, but Ferdinand still exists because I've been too lazy to reorganize my shelves. When you take every book off your shelf to create into a pile to become your new book friend, it's hard to get the motivation to actually put them all back on your shelf, even though you should. It's just one of those things that feels like, well, if I'm going to reorganize my whole bookshelf, that's a whole endeavor. So Ferdinand is still here. Shout out to Ferdinand. Let's see if he makes it to 2022. Odds are that he will probably be all right. Odds are he's gonna be all right. Odds are he's gonna be all right tonight. White Knight versus Battleground. White Knight has the conclusion of some really awesome stuff that's been long running in Dresden at that point. Battleground is the current book we have. That's the conclusion of a significant number of plot lines that have been going. Some of them not handled, as I mentioned before, as well as other story elements in the series were handled. But I think if I'm just going to pick like raw feelings on those two books, I'll probably pick Battleground. Some people may not love that. Battleground is just pretty much one massive giant battle. But during that battle, a lot of really important things happen. A lot of things are revealed that are huge. I feel like I'm going to make a lot of people mad, but I'm going to pick Battleground here. The Atlantis Gene versus Name of the Wind. I didn't remember that I read that one this year. When I talked about the Atlantis Gene being A.G. Riddle's first trilogy, and his writing wasn't as good, there's still an insane breakneck pace. The plot is still huge and world epic crazy, but the Atlantis Gene is one that I mostly have forgotten at this point. It's not A.G. Riddle's best work, and it's against the Name of the Wind, which I mentioned I can't get out of my head, even though I feel like of all the books in this list, I might be able to rant about it one of the most. I'm still going to give this round to Name of the Wind, I think. Next, we have The Bands of Mourning, Book 3 in Mistborn Era 2, versus The Alloy of Law, Book 1 from Mistborn Era 2, and this is where we get to one of the things that everyone says they want me to do, but I hate to do, which is to compare books in a series that I like, because I like to think of books in a series as a whole story, but now I actually have to compare and contrast them. The Bands of Mourning does a lot of amazing things that's going to be important for the Cosmere and Mistborn 2 moving forward. Some of the major spoilers from the Bands of Mourning, I'd already had spoiled for me for the major Cosmere implications, so it didn't hit as hard at the ending as I thought it should. It's still a lot of fun. I will say this about the Alloy of Law. The Alloy of Law is so dang fun. It was such a shock in the almost standalone nature of the way that it works is so good. And it's not the best moments. It doesn't have the best moments from Mistborn Era 2, but the way that it works at introducing you into Mistborn Era 2, the way that the action works. If I had to just pick one of those to read right now, it would probably be the Alloy of Law again, even though the Bands of Mourning is way more significant in the Cosmere overall. And yes, I'm super looking forward to book 4, which is supposed to come out next year, I believe, which means I'm going to read all 3 of these probably again next year. Anyway, if I had to just pick a favorite, I would pick the Alloy of Law. Turncoat versus The Wise Man's Fear. I've already voiced that The Wise Man's Fear has the same elements from the first book of the Kingkiller Chronicles, where I have significant frustrations and parts that I find baffling because I can't understand why they are there. Well, also, it's intriguing. I was very engaged while I was with The Wise Man's Fear. Because we're left with an unfinished series, I find just extremely confusing. Turncoat has a lot of really important Dresden moments. Because I'm not spoiling things, it is what it is. If I have to pick between these two books, I think I'm going to pick Turncoat. We have made it to round 3. This is a grueling tournament. It's so close. I'm getting more frustrated as we move on. There's still probably going to be some struggles that I have, but I'm excited because the rounds are getting shorter. We are now in round 3. Let's go. Ship of Magic versus Piranesi. I've mentioned that Ship of Magic was one of my most disappointing books this year, but it still made it this far in the tournament, versus Piranesi, which was this really happy, cool fairy tale that I talked about. We're going to talk about Ship of Magic versus Piranesi. Piranesi is going to take it. That was an easy one. Morningstar versus Changes, one of the best books in the Dresden Files, versus Morningstar, the conclusion of the Red Rising trilogy. I loved the Red Rising trilogy. When I read the Red Rising trilogy, I felt really invested and I loved everything that was going on. And there's a lot of things that happened in Morningstar that I loved, and I've already mentioned the insane thing that the author does. The way that Dresden has stuck with me in large part because of the major events that happen in Changes. Changes is going to have to take this one. So Changes is going to beat Morningstar. Even though I love both those series, I love Dresden more, and Dresden in Changes, it's way more significant. It affected me more than Morningstar, even though I loved Morningstar when I read it. Hasn't stuck with me as hard as Dresden. House of M versus Cold Days. I can't believe that House of M made it this far. I think it's just because of the way that it was lined up. Cold Days is going to take this one. House of M was fine, but it's also a comic book that's mostly transitory in my brain. Skin Game versus Red Rising. As much praise as I've given Red Rising, and as much as it connected with me, and as much as I binged that book, Skin Game has the culmination of many, many, many quest lines that have been going throughout the Dresden series. I feel like this should be a harder battle for me, but when I really sit down and think about the events that happen in Skin Game and how invested I was in Dresden by this point, even though I love Red Rising, and I don't want anyone to take this as a knock against Red Rising, I'm going to give this one to Skin Game. Next up, Shadows of Self versus Red Seas Under Red Skies. So, Red Seas Under Red Skies, the prose is better. It's by Scott Lynch. Scott Lynch's prose is significantly better than Brandon Sanderson's. The dialogue in Red Seas Under Red Skies is much better than Brandon Sanderson's dialogue, though I think that in Mistborn Era 2, Brandon Sanderson does that quite well. Scott Lynch is amazing at character banter. The storyline in Shadows of Self is significantly better than the randomness that happens in Red Seas Under Red Skies. The implications for the series as a whole might be similar, but the Cosmere stuff is something I'm generally more attached to. Shadows of Self I binged and I couldn't put down. It was a lot shorter than Red Seas Under Red Skies. But Red Seas Under Red Skies was one of my more disappointing books, and Shadows of Self was a book that I loved, and it was still surprising. For all of this, and for all of the disappointment that I had with book 2, After the Lives of Locke Lamora, and the fact that it didn't live up to its predecessor, I want to say that Red Seas Under Red Skies deserves more love than I initially gave it because of Scott Lynch's amazing writing, even though parts of that thing are super frustrating, and it does feel like it drags a bit, and there are some amazing individual moments that happen there. I'm going to pick Shadows of Self here. I don't think that should be a big surprise. More of a surprise that Red Seas Under Skies made it this long. This is only difficult for me to talk about because the more that I think about it, the more that I realize Scott Lynch's writing has some really amazing qualities to it that are contrasts to the part where Brandon Sanderson is weak. But if I'm just going to pick a book here that I liked more, it is going to be Shadows of Self. I don't know why I'm trying to pretend to have some sort of objective standard here. It's going to be the Mistborn Era 2 book. Proven Guilty versus Project Hail Mary. Project Hail Mary did win the last one, which was against Golden Sun, and it is a little bit unfortunate that the Red Rising series is taking the beating that it is this round, because I did love that series, and if I were going to just rank them myself, it would have gone differently. That being said, Project Hail Mary has gotten the love I want to give for it. It was positive, it was fun. We're talking about Dresden here, though, and one of the important books in Dresden. I'm going to pick Proven Guilty for this round. I feel like the rounds are getting easier, even though they should be getting harder. I don't know if that's just me and my mindset, or if just some of the weird early matches up were really heavy. Battleground versus Name of the Wind. Battleground is one massive battle. The Name of the Wind is a significant portion of the early life of Kvothe. The Name of the Wind intrigues me in a way that parts of Battleground don't. But if we take the series as a whole, I enjoy Dresden more than the Kingkiller Chronicles. As individual books, which of these has me the most passionate? And the surprise here is, as a whole, I like Dresden more than the Kingkiller Chronicles. But as far as individual things that stuck in my head the most, I don't think Battleground is the Dresden book that, with the exception of a few key moments, is as affecting to me as The Name of the Wind is at setting up the worlds that they're part of. And this is a really hard one. And I think that Patrick Rothfuss and Jim Butcher are even friends. I've watched interviews where they talk to each other, and this feels like I'm putting two of my favorite reads together. As much things as I throw about Patrick Rothfuss and the Kingkiller Chronicles, that series has stuck with me in a really interesting way. Surprisingly, just based on these individual books, I think The Name of the Wind is somehow going to push past this round. Did that one surprise you? I'm curious if I'm making the right choice here, if I will regret this later. It does seem like something that if I look at it a week from now, I'll be like, why the heck did I do that? But honestly, if I'm just looking at the way they've stuck with me, frick, the thing about The Name of the Wind is there's some serious bullcrap in that book. There's some seriously confusing, weird freaking choices in that book. But which one do I want to think about more? The Name of the Wind or Battleground? But there's some... Should it be Name of the Wind? Dresden is more than the sum of its parts. The Kingkiller is much more than the sum of its parts. This one is so hard. I think, frick. I think I'm going to put Name of the Wind here, and I don't know if that's the right choice here. The Alloy of Law versus Turncoat. Frick. I've already talked about how much I love The Alloy of Law, and how fun it is, and how well the action's handled, and how surprised I was. Turncoat was similarly, it's a Dresden book that I was super surprised by. There's a lot of really good story stuff in it. But when I think about individual books versus series, I want to give this to The Alloy of Law. Even though there's some really good stuff that happens in Turncoat. If I'm just going to be honest, and I'm just going to go with my gut feeling, and I'm not going to overthink individual moment versus individual moment, if I have to pick here, I'm going to pick The Alloy of Law. Okay, that round I feel like had some serious pain, and I probably will regret it. I have regrets already, and I will probably continue to have regrets. But let's move into round 4. We're down to 8 books to be my favorite book of the year. First round, Piranesi versus Changes. This one's fairly easy for me. Piranesi is amazing, and like I said, it sparks the imagination in ways that a lot of modern books don't. It gave me fairy tale vibes and feelings that I haven't felt in reading since I was a child, but it is short, it's not super deep, and if I was just going to pick the impact that it had with me, staying impact, initial impact, Changes is going to win it. Like, that's a huge moment in the series that it's one of my favorite series. Piranesi does not deserve any disrespect, though. Cold Days versus Skin Game. While there's some really awesome moments that happen in Cold Days, and I've already given that book a little bit of praise, this one I think is going to go to Skin Game. Let's just do it. Next up, we have Shadows of Self versus Proven Guilty. I'm just gonna do it. It's gonna be Shadows of Self. I know that it seemed like a struggle before, and I don't know how to handle this Dresden versus Mistborn Era 2 thing, where like both these series are my favorite. But I'm gonna pick Shadows of Self. I say it's gonna be easy, but I think that Proven Guilty had more emotionally charged moments for me. Even though Shadows of Self was more fun. It continues with Mistborn Era 2, which I love so much. I'm sure the camera's focusing on Ferdinand right now because my head is down, but I don't know what to do because this one is really challenging. If I don't think about it, I want to click Shadows of Self. But when I think about how much I love Dresden and all of the elements of Dresden, do I love any individual Dresden book as much as I love everything that happens in Dresden? Also, Shadows of Self was... I don't know! Let's see. Shadows of Self. We're talking prose. Jim Butcher's prose is better. Story in general. Shadows of Self is better. Character development moments. They both get a point. My enjoyment. They both get a point. I don't know why I'm thinking about this too much. I'm just going to pick Shadows of Self. Screw it. The Name of the Wind versus Alloy of Law. I'm not going to fall into the trap where I start fighting myself because this is such a freaking arbitrary bullcrap thing to do. And by that I mean it's very important in the BookTube Awards. The #1 winner of this thing is going to have the opportunity to sponsor me and give me all the arcs for the upcoming books. And I don't want to offend other authors with this very important battle of the books. If I have to pick The Name of the Wind versus Alloy of Law, they are so different and I love them for such different reasons that I'm just going to pick The Alloy of Law because that's a book series I think I might have a conclusion for. I think I might know the reason why things are in that book. Whereas The Name of the Wind, I may never get the answers to that question. Changes versus Skin Game is the semifinals round #1. And I'm going to go with the way that I felt after the end of each of those books. Changes may be the most important book of the Dresden Files in a lot of ways. But I like the way that I felt after I read Skin Game more for reasons that are spoilers. And this may not be popular because it may be that Changes is a better book. But we're going by my metric, which is at this point, I don't know and I have to pick because people make me pick. And Skin Game made me feel happier because I liked some of the things that happened in that more than the stuff that happened in Changes that left me feeling hollow and empty and sad inside in the same way that I felt when a lot of sad things happened in my childhood because I don't like change. Some things that are changing are good, and a lot of things that are changing are bad, but changes generally I'm scared of and they hurt my feelings. So I'm going to pick Skin Game. If I have to pick between Shadows of Self and the Alloy of Law, it's a difference in, can we praise books for being super fun and relatively lighthearted and actiony versus books that can try to do those things but also have a deeper and more important theme. And if I'm going with my gut, it's going to be The Alloy of Law, which I mentioned at the beginning is one of my favorite books of the year. Going to move that one forward. And here, I'm not going to stress over this. 2 of my favorite series have made it to the end here. And I think that I've expressed my difficulty with this category. As a book, The Alloy of Law, I found to be probably my favorite book that I read this year. And I do find that to be true if I look at all the books throughout the tournament. The Dresden Files is my favorite series maybe that I've read this year. As a whole, it has affected me so much more than almost any individual book here. But the individual books themselves, I don't think hit me the same way as all of the pieces combined. Whereas The Alloy of Law is a standalone book that I can pick up. And yes, it is partially because the tone of it is lighter and it's more digestible. But as a standalone book to pick as a single book, The Alloy of Law is going to be my #1 book of the year. How many of you predicted it? How many of you knew what the answer was going to be before I even started? Were any of the rounds controversial to you? This has been an epic long process, but this is a process that represents the amazing opportunity that I've had to share my reading experiences with you, with everyone in the Discord, with all of my friends that have their own channels. This is a representation of the amazing stories that I've been able to read this year. And as hard as it was to compare all of my favorite book children, you guys like to see it usually. I'm curious which round is going to be the most surprising to the most people. Let me know in the comments down below. If you're looking forward to the things that are coming in 2022 from this channel, please subscribe to the channel. I would like to say, if you know somebody that likes reading and is not aware of the channel and you want to share a video with them, that would be awesome to help the algorithm understand what types of content that I make. I mentioned this in my last video, but I have some new ideas coming to the channel next year that are not simply book related, but are tangentially related to some of the subject matter that I address on the channel. And I'm curious to see if that type of content can coexist with book content and the algorithm can let me live. Once again, this represents an amazing year of reading with a lot of books that affected me strongly in lots of different ways. There are so many different positive aspects to all of these books, even the ones that didn't make it to the end of this list. I oftentimes can pick one thing about even the worst books on this list to say was worth reading the book for in some way. And because of the books that I was able to read this year, the books I was able to discover this year, the videos that I was able to watch from other content creators this year, the books that I've had recommended to me in the comments on this channel, the Discord this year, I think 2022 may be one of the best reading years I've ever had yet, and I am excited for it, and I am excited to continue talking with all of you. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching until the end of the video. Also, if you just skipped it to the end of the video to see how the rounds went, thank you so much for watching. I love you. I love you for watching this channel, period at all. I love having discussions with you. It's been an amazing year. It's been a crazy year. It's been a hard year, but it's also been a good year. And today is the last day of 2021. 2022, I'm hoping, is going to be even better and brighter and crazier in good ways. I would love to be able to meet up with people that I've met in the bookish community in 2022 sometime. I have so much optimism looking forward to 2022. I have renewed vigor to be reading, renewed vigor to be making content, renewed vigor to have discussions with people and find more interesting videos that you all make that I can partake of as a consumer. Happy freaking New Year. Go into 2022 and be excellent to each other. You may not want to take my advice because I'm not your dad, but let me tell you one thing, people out there. I am your best friend. Happy New Year. See you next year. Goodbye. Should odd acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? God and